Okay, well, now we can get started. Let me welcome you all to this evening's event with Amitav Ghosh. My name is Matthew Engelke. I'm the director of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life here at Columbia University. Dr. Ghosh's lecture for us, Future or Past, Climate Change as Seen from the Global North and South, is part of a project at IRCPL on rethinking public religion in Africa and South Asia. I'd like to acknowledge the generous support for this project from the Henry Luce Foundation, as well as one of our partners in this endeavor, Columbia's South Asia Institute, who have co-sponsored this evening's event. Now, throughout his novels and nonfiction work, Amitav Ghosh has often charted the intimate connections between two world historical forces, capitalism and colonialism. My own first exposure to his work was through his novel, Sea of Poppies, a sweeping tale that connects through rich portraits of people and places, shore and sea, the multiple desires that have fueled Western imperialism. One of the effects of these desires has been a ravaging of the environment, a theme that Dr. Ghosh has explored most explicitly in his lectures, The Great Derangement, Climate Change, and the Unthinkable, but also in his recent novel, Gun Island, which takes us into the mangrove-filled swamps of the Sundarbans, stretching along the Bay of Bengal. But in books like Sea of Poppies 2, this concern is already evident and central to the historical tale. The Sea of Poppies is quite literally one that constantly floods new plains, cash crops and climate change going hand in hand. Amitav Ghosh was trained as an anthropologist, and as an anthropologist myself, I'd like to think that this is perhaps part of why he is so attentive to what people say, to how people think across time and space, and to what fuels their hopes and desires. I look forward to hearing him tonight and to how he is now extending his projects and commitments. Let me also say that I look forward to hearing from you. We look forward to hearing from you later on. Before turning over to Dr. Ghosh, let me therefore just say a bit more about the course of this evening. Dr. Ghosh is going to speak to us for about 30 to 40 minutes. He and I will then engage in some discussion, building on the themes in his lecture, as well as the broader ambit of his interests and work. But we will then open the floor to discussion for you. So please do use the Q&A function. You should all see on your Zoom screens at the bottom two ways of communicating. One is a chat and one is Q&A. If you could put your questions into the Q&A function, really at any point from now until we're done speaking, we can then take note and try to get to as many questions as possible. Yes, that's all I wanted to say on the nuts and bolts. I did a few moments ago thank our funders and co-sponsor, but let me also now take a moment to express my thanks to IRCPL staff who have made this event possible, to Amitav Ghosh himself for joining us very generously on this autumn evening, and of course to all of you for contributing to this event. So now then I turn over to Amitav Ghosh to speak on Future or Past, Climate Change as Seen from the Global North and South. Thank you very much. I think you're still muted, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, well, hello to everyone, and Thank you, Matthew, for your very generous introduction, and thank you to everyone who's listening in. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, to be speaking with you. And I should begin with an apology because I actually had a sort of PowerPoint presentation all ready to go, but at the last minute, my computer started updating, and it's one of those incredible updates where it goes on and on and on. And so I'm afraid all of you are just stuck with looking at me, whereas you could have been looking at many interesting slides. So please forgive me for that. So I should explain that, since I wrote The Great Derangement, I've been working on, I've been extending the project and working on it in various ways. And actually, I've almost, my manuscript is almost ready. So what I'm going to do today is just, talk to you about a part of this new manuscript. So the manuscript is in this book. I try to avoid, in fact, talking about climate change, and I try to speak instead about a planetary crisis, because it seems to me that there are two very different ways of looking at this at our current predicament. And certainly the COVID pandemic has made it very clear to us once again that what we are in is a multidimensional crisis of many different kinds. But in the West today, I think it's fair to say that climate change has come to be seen. Matthew, if you don't mind, I think my computer has just come back on. Should I, if you don't mind taking a couple of minutes, I could go back to that.
Right, so you can get your images.
Yes, it'll be ready in a little bit, but I'll just go on for the moment. So in the West today, I think it's fair to say that climate change has come to be thought of as a phenomenon that's framed primarily by science, technology, and economics. Inasmuch as issues of power figure within this frame, they're usually represented as being determined by economic factors or by the broader workings of capitalism. Matthew, should I take a minute and just set up my computer?
If it's ready, yes, and then we can. So you'll log back onto your own computer where the slides are.
Yes, if you don't mind, it will just take a couple of minutes.
Okay, we will wait. I will juggle.
I'll leave this on for the moment. So, and my apologies once again for this.
That's fine. I'm sure we can wait.
Well, it shouldn't take too long.
No, that's fine. I'm sure that it'll be wonderful to have some images.
Yes, I find that it's somehow. There we are. Okay. Almost there. Okay, so I'm going to join on this other device. It's connecting.
Oh, we have two of you.
Okay, so I'll stop this one.
Okay.
And can you see me? Yes, you can see.
Yes, there we are. Yes, wonderful.
Good. Good.
Great.
So I just have to share my screen with you now.
Okay, wonderful.
But the host has disabled participant screen sharing. So
I think we can get that.
Yeah,
fixed.
Christina will have to address that.
Yeah, we can get that fixed momentarily, I'm sure.
Yes. Well,
I think we're on the case.
Okay. Well, in the meantime, I'll just carry on then.
Okay.
So, okay, great.
Yes, you can share now. Okay.
Okay. Can you see the screen now?
Yes, wonderful.
All right. I'm going to do the participant. Okay. You can see it. You can see it now, right?
Yes.
All right. So, as I was saying, climate change has come to be framed sort of very much within a technological, scientific, and economic perspective. So indeed, the very phrase climate change has come to refer not just to a process that is unfolding in the world. If you look at these, images, you'll see that they're all enumerative. They're all in terms of numbers. They frame the whole issue in terms of numbers and in terms of science and technology. So because of this techno-economic framing, the subject of climate change has come to be enclosed within within a palisade of scientific and academic expertise. Indeed, the very phrase climate change has come to refer not just to a process that is unfolding in the world, but also to a highly specialized specialized field of knowledge, one that extends across a wide swathe of learned disciplines, ranging from the atmospheric sciences to engineering, law, economics, and so on. This large and constantly growing field is located primarily within Western institutions of learning. No matter whether we, and of course your own institution is one of the leaders in this field. So no matter whether we speak of paleobotany, renewable energy, carbon taxes, or climate economics, the great bulk of the research on these subjects is produced by colleges, universities, and think tanks in the global north. Not only is the credentialed work on these subjects produced in such institutions, those credentials also set the agenda for the discussion of the phenomenon itself. The people who sit on UN panels and government committees are usually the very people who produce the credentialed work on climate change. In other words, the phenomenon of climate change and the research that surrounds it have come to be almost totally identified with each other. Now, arguably, there exists no other sphere of contemporary life in which there is so great an overlap between a phenomenon and the credentialed literature that frames it. In discussions of the economy, for instance, it isn't assumed that only economists or academic experts can speak of the subject. It's generally accepted that workers, shopkeepers, factory managers, stockbrokers, and so on, people who have no acquaintance with the expert literature, it's accepted that they may have valid perspectives of their own. Now, climate change is a much vaster phenomenon than the economy. Yet the voices and perspectives of those who are affected by it, farmers, fisherfolk, migrants, and so on, very rarely figure in the discussion. And when they do, it's usually merely as victims whose voices fill in the blanks in a script that has already been written by specialists. Now, it goes without saying that if it were not for experts, the world would not be talking about climate change at all. The causes and impacts of the atmospheric changes that are now unfolding across the planet could not have been investigated without climate science. It is the work that climate scientists do that has uncovered the interconnections of various Earth systems and the feedback loops they create. Some of these scientists, like my Twitter buddy, Michael Mann, some of these scientists have persevered in the teeth of death threats, harassments, and opposition, not just from governments, but also from energy corporations. There's James Hansen who has a long connection with Columbia. The world owes him and many of these other climate scientists a great debt of gratitude, not only for their work, but also for taking important positions on this subject. Yet it needs to be recognized that even if climate scientists had not done this invaluable work, climate change itself would not disappear, any more than the economy would disappear in the absence of economists. It isn't primarily through the work of economists, after all, that workers, businessmen, and bankers are alerted to fluctuations in prices and salaries. Indeed, in some instances, bankers, trade unionists, and shopkeepers may know more about the phenomenon that we call the economy than economists do. Nor is it the case that humans and human societies are incapable of comprehending and responding to climatic disruptions in the absence of modern science. During the Little Ice Age of the 17th century, Japan's rulers understood that something was awry in their environment and acted accordingly. As a result, Japan was spared the turmoil that hit many other parts of the world during those years. So while there is every reason to be grateful to climate scientists and other specialists for the work they do, this should not obscure the fact that academically credentialed experts are by no means the only diviners of climate change. People who make their living from the land or the forest or the sea have also known for a while that the Earth's physical realities are changing dramatically. For those who observe their surroundings carefully, the indications of long-term change can come from unexpected sources. For an indigenous group of Central Australia, indications that the climate is changing came from the impact of flooding on a site associated with initiation rites. For other indigenous Australians, the signs lay in the behavior of plants and animals. Some trees were not flowering in the right season. Some fish were not biting as they used to. Wattle trees were not flowering as they used to when in relation to the barramundi. So in his book, Wisdom Sits in Places, the anthropologist Keith H. Basso writes about an elder of the Western Apache, Charles Henry, for whom the clues to the changes in his environment lay in place names. He noticed, for instance, that water no longer flows at what was once a spring called Snake's Water, or at another place called Bird's Water. Henry saw that the plants from which some places took their names no longer grew there. For instance, a place called Stand of Arrowcane no longer had that species of cane, which needs moist conditions to thrive. These places are all tied to stories that describe how they got their names. Snake's Water, for instance, was once owned by snakes, and people had to ask their permission before they could drink there. The discrepancies between the names, the stories, and the realities of the present day made it obvious to Charles Henry that this part of Arizona was getting drier. The names do not lie, he says. They show what is different and what is the same. Steeped in the lore of the land, a man like Charles Henry observes his surroundings with the closeness of attention that is made possible by the very fact of his distance from mainstream culture. The same pattern replicates itself across the globe. Those who are most attentive to environmental change are, more often than not, people who are on the margins, people whose relationships to the soil or the forest or the water are minimally mediated by technology. The farmer who is most likely to pay attention to a prolonged drought, for instance, is one who cannot afford an electric pump or chemical inputs. The fisher who is most likely to observe changes in the marine environment is one who does not have sonar equipment to locate schools of fish. The woman who is most likely to notice rainfall deficits is she who does not have access to piped water and must walk miles to ever more distant wells. But such people are generally poor and do not have access to the networks through which information is disseminated. They are, in fact, located at the opposite end of the social spectrum from the majority of the world's scientists and academics. Experts are not at fault, of course, for the skewed way in which the world gathers information. They can hardly be held responsible for the social context in which they work. But it's nonetheless important to recognize that the reason our first messages about climate change came from scientists rather than marginal farmers or women who fetch water is not because scientists were the only people to notice what was underway. It was because scientists were better able to make themselves heard within the circles that wield power in the world. Sadly, they were themselves too distant from those circles to make their voices heard loudly enough. Within the credentialed discourse, fossil fuels are seen as sources of energy, of which there are many others, including water, wind, and the sun. The latter sources have the great advantage that they do not produce greenhouse gases as fossil fuels do. And since it is now known that atmospheric carbon dioxide poses a dire threat to humanity, reason dictates that every effort should be made to move with the greatest possible urgency from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy. Innumerable pathways to such a transition have been charted, and it is perfectly clear now that energy from renewable sources could certainly meet enough of the world's needs to bring about a substantial reduction in the world's greenhouse gas emissions. A partial transition is not only technically feasible, it could also bring many other benefits as well, such as new jobs, as is proposed in the Green New Deal. Yet the fact remains that the world is not much closer to such a transition today than it was decades ago. If anything, the opposite is the case. Corporations that invested in solar energy have been pulling out of the industry in recent years. Across the world, over several decades, fossil fuel consumption was rising steadily until it was brought to a sharp, shuddering halt in 2020. And this sudden downturn was brought about not by policies or economic considerations, but rather a virus that sprang out from the edges of a remote forest. Clearly, the world has every incentive to phase out fossil fuels and move towards a greener economy. What then prevents it from doing so? This question, so essential to the world's future, has been addressed at length by many important thinkers and analysts, perhaps most significantly Naomi Klein. In general, the answers tend to point towards those who have profited economically from fossil fuels. That is to say, a small number of corporations and individuals who have vested interests in the carbon economy and are determined to go on making money, even at the cost of destroying the world. These arguments are persuasive and well-grounded. There is no doubt whatsoever in my mind that capitalism and neoliberalism are powerful obstacles to an energy transition. But it's also clear to me that an exclusive focus on the economy can prevent us from identifying other obstacles to an energy transition that are not easily enumerable or quantifiable. The only way these obstacles can be identified is by stepping outside the framework in which fossil fuels are resources that are, in principle, similar to other resources that produce energy. That is, in order to identify these obstacles, we have to also identify the properties that make a kilowatt produced by fossil fuels different from the same quantity of energy generated by solar panels and windmills. For it isn't only because they produce energy that fossil fuels have come to be established at the core of modern life. It is also because the energy they produce interacts with structures of power in ways that are specific to fossil fuels. This connection was explicitly established in the English language at the dawn of the era of fossil fuels by joining the dual sense of potency and energy in the word power. The fact that fossil fuels possess the property of reinforcing structures of power has from the start favored them over other sources of energy. The historian Andreas Malm has shown, for instance, that the standard narrative of the Industrial Revolution, which is that the invention of coal-powered steam engines by James Watt in 1776 kicked off a rapid transition to a carbon economy in Britain, is simply not true. Though almost a century of the period that is identified as the era of the Industrial Revolution, through almost a century of after the Industrial Revolution is thought to have started, water was the main energy source for both British and American industry. The reason why coal-powered mills won out over their water-powered competitors in the early 19th century, Andreas Malm has shown, was not because coal was cheaper or more efficient. Water-powered mills were just as productive and far cheaper to operate than coal-fired mills. It was for social rather than technical or economic reasons that steam-powered machines prevailed, because, for example, they allowed mill owners to locate their factories in densely crowded cities where cheap labor was easily available. The material characteristics of oil make it even more potent than coal in its ability to reinforce structures of power. For the ruling classes, coal had one great drawback, which was that it had to be extracted by large numbers of miners, working in conditions that ensured their radicalization. This was why miners were at the forefront of the world's labor movements through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As your very own Timothy Mitchell has shown, this was one of the reasons why Anglo-American elites decided to engineer a switchover from coal to oil as the world's main source of energy. Unlike coal, the extraction and transportation of oil does not require large numbers of workers. It frees capital from local entanglements and allows it to roam the world at will. In short, fossil fuels have from the start been enmeshed with human lives in ways that tend to reinforce the power of ruling classes. The same is true also in relation to countries, regions, and indeed continents. That modernity established a directly transitive relationship between economic growth and fossil fuels is often acknowledged. What usually passes unremarked is that exactly the same equation holds true for fossil fuels in relation to war making. In other words, a country's ability to project military force is directly connected to the size of its carbon footprint. And this has been true since the early 19th century. This transitivity was established early in the 19th century, and it gave the British Empire an insuperable advantage, especially on the seas. For instance, the British expeditionary force that set sail for China in 1840, at the start of the First Opium War, was insignificant in size, consisting of a couple of dozen warships and around 4,000 fighting men. But this small force was able to inflict a series of resounding defeats on the army and navy of the Qing Empire, in no small part because it had a secret weapon, a coal-powered steamer called the Nemesis, the first of a kind to venture into the Indian Ocean. The steamer lived up to her name in battle after battle, destroying entire fleets with ease. That the Chinese Navy was badly led and ill-equipped was immaterial. The greatest admirals of the age of sail would have fared no better. Drake, de Ruyter, and Nelson, with all their skill or experience, it has been said, could have done nothing against one steam man of war. Even at that time, it was thought by many that the Nemesis would forever change the nature of naval warfare, and so she did. With the Nemesis, fossil fuels became central to warfare and the projection of military power. In effect, the First Opium War ushered in a new era, one that is far from over, an age marked by the ever-expanding military use of fossil fuels. Over the course of the 20th century, there was a steep rise in the use of fossil fuels in war making. During World War II, writes Michael Clare, the American military consumed 1 gallon of petroleum per soldier per day. During the first Gulf War of 1991, the rate rose to 4 gallons per soldier per day. In the Bush administration's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it leapt to 16 gallons per soldier per day. Today, the Pentagon is the single largest consumer of energy in the United States and probably in the world. The US military maintains vast fleets of vehicles, ships, and aircraft, and many of these consume huge amounts of fossil fuels. A non-nuclear aircraft carrier consumes 5,621 gallons of fuel per hour. They burn up as much fuel in one day as a small Midwestern town might use in a year. But a single F-16 aircraft consumes around 3 times more than that in 1 hour of ordinary operations, around 1,700 gallons. If the plane's afterburners are engaged, it consumes 8 times as much fuel per hour as an aircraft carrier, that is to say 14,400 gallons. In effect, a single F-16 burns more fuel in 1 hour than 28 American drivers would over a whole year. The US Air Force has around 1,000 F-16s, and they are but a small part of the air fleet. Needless to add, battle tanks, armored cars, Humvees, etc., also require large amounts of fuel. Nor are these machines idle in peacetime. Many of them are in constant use, not just for purposes of training and maintenance, but also because the United States' 900 domestic military installations need to be connected to its network of 800 bases in other countries. In the 1990s, the 3 branches of the US military consumed approximately 25 billion tons of fuel per year. This was more than a fifth of the country's total consumption, and more than the total commercial energy consumption of nearly 2/3 of the world's countries. During the years of the Iraq War, the US military was consuming around 1.3 billion gallons of oil annually for its Middle Eastern operations alone. That was more than the annual consumption of Bangladesh, a country of 180 million people. These activities come with other environmental costs as well. The Department of Defense generates 500,000 tons of toxic waste annually, more than the top 5 US chemical companies combined. And a lot of this waste goes into what are now known as sacrifice zones, where minorities are disproportionately affected. This does not include the emissions and waste products that are generated in the process of constructing weapons, warships, and warplanes. Nor does this take into account the rapid expansion of another sector of the military, defense contractors, whose presence is growing quickly around the globe. But the US Department of Defense is by no means the only military establishment in the world that is dependent on vast quantities of fossil fuels. This is true also of every major and minor power around the world. The armed forces of China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Turkey, and India are expanding very rapidly, and they're all spending huge amounts of money on energy-intensive systems. It is instructive in this regard to compare the world's military expenditures with its spending on climate change mitigation. At the UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen in 2009, it was agreed that wealthy countries would channel $100 billion a year to poorer nations to help them cope with the impacts of climate change. But the Green Climate Fund, set up by the UN, succeeded in raising only $10.43 billion and is now running out of money. It never came anywhere close to being funded at the level envisaged at the summit. But in that same period, the world's annual military expenditure has risen from slightly above $1.5 trillion to almost $2 trillion. To look these facts in the face is to recognize that it's a grave error to imagine that the world is not preparing for the disrupted world of the future. It's just that it's not preparing by taking mitigatory measures or by reducing emissions. Instead, it is preparing for war. The geopolitical aspects of the world's current energy regime rarely figure in the expert discourse on climate change, perhaps because these aspects of the current energy regime are not easily enumerable and do not allow for technological solutions. Yet, geopolitics is probably an even greater obstacle to an energy transition than is capitalism. It is often said nowadays that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. It is telling that this aphorism has now attained the status of received wisdom, because it takes only a moment's reflection to realize that it is patently untrue. The majority of the world's population did not live in capitalist societies for much of the 20th century. Even in the West, the normal functioning of capitalism was suspended for years during the 2 world wars. What has never been suspended since the 16th century are the dynamics of global empire. Indeed, they were at the root of both world wars. Imperial powers, even as they fought each other in Europe, would often collaborate in the colonies to ensure that European dominance would continue afterwards. That which is really harder to imagine than the end of the world is the end of the absolute geopolitical dominance of the West. Yet it is precisely this prospect that now looms ahead, adding a further dimension of uncertainty to the planetary crisis. All bodies of knowledge. Let me just stop there for a moment. Matthew, can you hear me okay? Is everything, am I audible? Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great. All bodies of knowledge are shaped and marked by the circumstances from which they emerge. Since the bulk of the literature on climate change comes out of Western universities, it is inevitably marked by the methods and practices of those institutions. The methods of scientists in particular have profoundly shaped the way that climate change is imagined and thought about. Take, for instance, a method that is in widespread use among climate scientists, that of using models to make projections in relation to a future date. Using this method, a scientist might predict, for example, that sea levels will rise by so many meters over the next 30 years, or that greenhouse gas concentrations will grow in this way. An unintended consequence of this practice is that it reinforces a perception of climate change that abstracts it from the past and projects it in the opposite direction toward the future. This perception has come to color most of the thinking that goes into climate change, especially in the West. No matter whether in economics or law, or indeed fiction, global warming is almost always imagined in relation to the future. To be sure, historians have not neglected to provide historical contexts for global warming. But theirs is bound to be a minority view in a field where the pinpointing of what is new and unprecedented is crucial to the identification of the phenomenon itself. Consider, for example, a method that is often used to ascertain whether or not a weather event has been influenced by human activity. To do this, scientists often proceed by comparing contemporary heat waves and hurricanes to those of the past. If a heat wave can be shown to have no precedence in the historical record, then the likelihood of its having been impacted by human activity rises. The unprecedented nature of the event thus becomes evidence that it has been impacted by human activity. This is, of course, a very useful method. Yet, when an argument is presented in this way, it becomes easy to lose sight of the fact that while an event may be unprecedented, the human activities that have left their fingerprint on it are actually embedded in long and enduring patterns of history. Since the events are unprecedented and therefore new, it seems almost self-evident that the era of climate change is itself radically new, separated from preceding ages by a clean break. And thanks to the academic practice of assigning dates to geological periods, we may even soon be provided with a date for when the world tipped over into a new era, the Anthropocene. In imagining this era as radically new, it becomes easy also to imagine that the break with the past has created many other phenomena that are distinct and different from those that existed before. Hence, climate justice takes on a coloring that sets it apart from justice in general. And climate migration takes on a hue that makes it seem different from other, more familiar forms of displacement. It becomes tempting to imagine that this new era is suffused with phenomena that are waiting to be identified as unprecedented and utterly novel. It was with exactly these assumptions in mind that I began to follow the so-called European migration crisis that started in 2015. The images that began to circulate at that time of refugees crossing the Mediterranean in rickety boats or trekking across mountains with their children clinging to their backs was so powerful that I could not wrench my eyes away from them. But as I combed through this material, I gradually became aware of a striking discrepancy. In newspaper reports, the refugees were described more often than not as being from war-torn parts of Asia or sub-Saharan Africa, that is to say Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, Eritrea, and so on. Rarely, if ever, was there any mention of refugees from South Asia. Yet, in picture after picture of boats in the Mediterranean, and of people crossing the Balkans, I could see faces that were recognizably South Asian. Uh, any of you, I hope you can see my pointer there. Any South Asian looking at this picture, for instance, will recognize South Asian faces. I mean, anybody will really. Uh, so, looking at these pictures, I could see faces that were recognizably South Asian. Indeed, it seemed to me that a good number of these refugees were from the very part of the world where my own roots lie. That is to say, the Bengal Delta. Look at this a picture of the so-called Libyan slave auctions. And among the African faces, you can also very clearly see South Asian faces and probably Bengali faces. So I began to dig into the official statistics from Italy, the country that was at that time, along with Greece, receiving the largest number of refugees. And I discovered that I was right. Many Bengalis, most of them young men, were indeed making these difficult and dangerous journeys. The statistics showed that in some months, Bangladeshis were actually the second largest group of refugees crossing the Mediterranean to seek shelter in Italy. I discovered to my astonishment that at times Bangladeshis far outnumbered Iraqis, Afghans, or Somalis. This confounded me because while Bangladesh may have its problems, it can hardly be described as a war-torn country. Nor is the country's economy in dire straits. Bangladesh has actually been one of the top performers globally for the last several years, and its growth rate surpassed India's in 2018. Indeed, Bangladesh's performance has been so impressive that a leading economist recently observed that the country is on a path that would have been unimaginable just 2 decades ago toward becoming an Asian success story. Why then, I began to wonder, was so many Bangladeshis undertaking these hazardous journeys across West Asia and North Africa to Europe? That climate change might hold the answer seemed obvious. Climate migration is, after all, a recognized phenomenon. And people who have been displaced by environmental impacts are often described as climate migrants or climate refugees. That Bangladesh and the Bengal Delta, more generally, is exceptionally vulnerable to climate change is a well-known fact. Much of the country lies less than 1 meter above sea level, and it has already lost a good deal of land to the rising waters. In 2005, the partial sinking of a single island led to the displacement of more than 500,000 people. Scientists have long predicted that flooding and saltwater intrusion will displace millions more from the low-lying plains of the Bengal Delta. Was it possible, I wondered, that some of the refugees on those rickety boats were in fact climate migrants, displaced by the impacts of global warming? Surely that had to be the case. How could it not be so? To find answers to these questions at second hand was all but impossible, since South Asians rarely figured in media reports. At a certain point, it became clear to me that I would have to talk directly with the refugees themselves. So in 2016, with the help of a number of organizations that work with refugees, I traveled across Italy, visiting holding camps and other facilities, and especially seeking out South Asians who had recently crossed the Mediterranean by boat. It was my intuition from the start that speaking to refugees in their own languages would provide fresh perspectives, and in this I was amply vindicated. In Parma, through the good offices of a voluntary organization called Escapes, I met a 30-something Bengali refugee who had recently crossed the Mediterranean. I'm only showing you half his face so that he's not too recognizable. I'll call him Khokun. He was in his mid-30s and had grown up in a village in Bangladesh's Kishoreganj district. His was a family of farmers, and as a boy, Khokun had worked on his father's land while also attending a local school. Khokun remembered a time when the land had borne good harvests of rice, sustaining the whole family. But the environment had begun to change as he was growing up. There were sudden and catastrophic inundations caused sometimes by heavy rains, and sometimes by the release of huge volumes of water by dams upstream in India. In 1998, Khokun's family land was flooded for 6 months. The incidence of other weather-related disasters began to increase as well. There were prolonged dry spells, violent hailstorms, and unseasonal downpours. As the environmental disruptions accelerated, the political situation also began to deteriorate. Members of the ruling party seized some of Khokun's family's land and they were unable to get it back. The conditions in the district are lethal now, Khokun told me. Before it was just oppression. Now on top of the oppression, there's disaster after disaster. In the end, Khokun's father decided that the family's best hope lay in selling a part of their lands and using the proceeds to pay a dalal, or agent, to send Khokun abroad. So the land was sold and the money enabled Khokun, who was then in his 20s, to travel to France, but to no avail, for he was soon deported back to Bangladesh. He stayed home for 7 months, but was unable to find any employment. So his family sold the rest of their land and paid another agent to send him abroad again. Dubai was where Khokun wanted to go and he paid accordingly. But the agent cheated him and he ended up in Libya instead. For the next several years, he had to endure enslavement, beatings, extortion, and torture. But somehow he managed to save up enough money to pay traffickers to send him from Libya to Sicily in a ramshackle boat. The journey was a nightmare. Those who paid extra were accommodated on the boat's upper deck. Khokun was down below near the engine, packed in with dozens of others in suffocating heat. A man who vomited was thrown overboard. Many others died as well. By the time the journey ended at the Italian island of Lampedusa, Khokun was traumatized. But various support groups for refugees gave him shelter and he eventually traveled to Parma, where he had relatives and found a job at a warehouse. After hearing Khokun out, I thought, if ever there was a story of climate migration, then this is surely it. Khokun himself was well able to see that environmental disruptions had played a major part in setting him off on his journey. He was well informed about global warming, as is often the case with people from Bangladesh, where climate-related information is widely disseminated by the government and by many non-governmental organizations. Khokun was certainly well aware that sea levels are rising and that rainfall is growing more erratic because of broader changes in the global climate. But when I asked him whether it would be accurate to describe his journey as an instance of climate migration, he flatly disagreed. No, he insisted, there were many other reasons for his departure. Political violence, the employment situation, family disagreements, and aspirations to a higher standard of living. There was also the additional factor of communications technology. As is often the case, Khokun's travels were intricately connected to the internet and social media. Elsewhere in Italy, I would meet many other migrants whose journeys seem to be self-evidently instances of climate migration. Many of them were also well informed about climate change. Yet none of them believed that their journeys had been driven primarily by environmental disruptions. In the face of this refusal, I was tempted to assume that these migrants were unwilling, for one reason or another, to acknowledge the reality of their predicament, perhaps because it might put them at a disadvantage in relation to Italian officialdom, or because of some sort of psychological blockage, rooted perhaps in personal pride. In any event, it seemed to me beyond dispute that these men were climate migrants, whether they knew it or not. I persuaded myself that I understood their stories better than they did themselves, because I had access to more authoritative, credentialed information. It wasn't till much later that I began to understand that the difference between the migrants' thinking and mine was that for them, climate change was not a thing apart, a phenomenon that could be isolated from other aspects of their experience by a set of numbers or dates. The experience was formed, rather, by sudden and catastrophic intersections of many different factors, of which some were undoubtedly new, like smartphones and changes in the weather. But some of these factors were not new at all, being rooted ultimately in deeply rooted structures of exploitation and conflict. Viewed from this perspective, climate change is but one aspect of a much broader planetary crisis. It is not the prime cause of dislocation, but rather a cognate phenomenon. Seen in this way, climate change, mass dislocations, pollution, environmental degradation, political breakdown, and the COVID-19 pandemic are all cognate effects of the ever-increasing acceleration in production, extraction, consumption, and environmental degradation that has occurred in the decades after the Second World War, and especially after 1989. Not only are these crises interlinked, they are all deeply rooted in history. and they're all ultimately driven by the dynamics of global power. When issues like climate migration and climate justice are discussed by experts in international conferences, one of the guiding assumptions is that the negotiations are intended to provide fair and just outcomes. Another such assumption, common to what is known as the liberal world order, is that structures of governance, national and international, exist in order to promote people's welfare and to advance the causes of equality, security, and justice. What migrants like Khokon know, on the other hand, is that every aspect of their plight is rooted in unyielding, intractable, and historically rooted forms of class and racial injustice. They know that if they were wealthy or white, they would not have to risk their lives on rickety boats. They know that the processes that have displaced them are embedded in very old and deeply entrenched social relationships of power, national and international. From that point of view, forms of governance, national and international, exist not to promote justice or welfare, but precisely in order to protect the systemic inequalities and injustices that produce the displacement of refugees. It is largely in affluent countries, then, that climate change is perceived as a techno-economic concern oriented towards the future. For the have-nots of the world, it is primarily a matter of justice, rooted in histories of race, class, and geopolitics. From this perspective, climate negotiations are not just about emissions and greenhouse gases. They hinge precisely upon issues that are not and can never be discussed, issues that are ultimately related to the global distribution of power. It is often said that climate change should be tackled as though it were a war. What refugees like Coco know is that climate change already is a war. Their experience of the planetary crisis is exactly that of a war. They experience its violence in crossing the border into Turkey, or in the slave camps of Libya or the Sinai, in the rickety boats that brings them across the Mediterranean, in the barrages of gunfire that greet them when they try to cross borders, and in the surgical facilities where their organs are harvested to be sold for thousands of dollars on the international market. They know that the obstacles that bar their way were put in place by long histories of inequity and geopolitical conflict. This is perfectly evident also to the middle classes of the global South, who may not experience the conflict as directly as refugees like Khokon. But for them too, the planetary crisis is ultimately framed by histories of inequity and colonization, rather than technology and economics. This is why middle-class Indians, Indonesians, or Chinese, if asked whether they are willing to make cuts in personal consumption, will usually respond by saying something along the lines of, why should we cut back our consumption and our emissions when they're still far below Western levels? Wouldn't that be unjust to us? The West enriched itself at our expense when we were weak and powerless. It's our turn to catch up now. Across much of the global South, these convictions are held with a strength of conviction that belies the idea that the planetary crisis can be addressed merely by fixing capitalism. At the heart of the crisis lie the geopolitical problems and inequities of power inherited from the era of colonization. Those issues cannot be wished away. There we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amitav. I wish we could include the audio applause that you so richly deserve if we could all be together. You've given us a lot to think about. Let me just remind the attendees, please do feel free to include your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. We already have a few questions lined up, and I'm very happy to take more as Amitav and I have a short conversation following up on some of the themes and issues that.
Matthew, if I may interrupt for one moment.
Sure.
Were you all able to see the slides that I showed? Because I seem to have got some messages saying people weren't able to see them.
I hope most people were. I think there were a few people who wrote to us on the side and we were able to fix their
Oh,
view.
good. Okay.
So I certainly hope that most people did see the slides.
Okay, great.
I hope we would have heard. We did hear from a few people, but yes, I'm hearing now from the chat. People could see the slides, so that's, or at least most people. So
okay,
that's great. Yeah, no, very, very important. And I'm very glad we took a moment to have you switch your computer, because it was very, very helpful to have that visual component. So I want to start with some questions that we can maybe have a conversation about. I'm very excited to see this project come to fruition. Very excited to hear that you have put some of your anthropological, some of your anthropological methods to use by doing some research in Italy, engaging with people on the ground. And of course, this does very much extend a number of the themes that you have been looking at, not only in the Great Derangement, but also some of your novels. But I want to pick up first on an issue that you flag in the title of your talk, with respect to time and future or past, and how we should understand this. You have a wonderful articulation of this in The Great Derangement, and I will read a brief quote here from that book. The Anthropocene has reversed the temporal order of modernity. Those at the margins are now the first to experience the future that awaits all of us. It is they who confront most directly what Thoreau called vast, titanic, inhuman nature. And I think that's a really wonderful reflection, or capturing something that is very much happening here. And I want to tie this actually to your invocation of Keith Basso. I was very pleased to see you engage with his work, because one of the things that he shows in his work, and indeed can be found in many other studies and through many other voices, is that there are of course different temporal orientations and different understandings of time, whether it is linear or cyclical, for instance. And that's relevant to the Apache case in the sense that certain places unlock memories, and therefore space and time are understood as connected to both personal biographies, but also community histories, right? And changes in the landscape. So I wonder if I can ask you to reflect a bit more on the other kinds of temporal orders that might be in play. Again, maybe specifically in the regions around the Bay of Bengal that you have written about. Different approaches to the relationship between our lives and our environments as understood through an understanding of time. So I wonder if you can speak more about how thinking about time otherwise might be productive in the approach to climate change, especially since linear time is so central to the narrative structuring of climate change, and for many good reasons, right? But what are the other ways of thinking about temporality that you might bring to the table, or that others are bringing to the table through the communities in the Sundarbans, or the migrants that you spoke with in Italy, coming from Bangladesh? Yeah, so I wonder if I can start with that question.
Thank you, Matthew, for that very thoughtful question. I find increasingly that the thinkers who are really helping me to think this through are Native American thinkers. thinkers and theorists. For example, Nick Estes has written a very, very powerful book about the Standing Rock, the No Dakota Pipeline protest, in which he makes this point. He says, what we see today in relation to climate change is that the indigenous figure is actually the essential subject of this era, the essential subject of modernity, even, if you like. The figure that was almost erased has now become, as it were, the figure where all these intersections are, where all these crises intersect. And, that's an instance, if you like, of the peripheral suddenly becoming, of the marginal suddenly becoming the central, if you like. Similarly, the thinker who I find has been very, very helpful for me in thinking through these issues is Vine Deloria Jr. Vine Deloria argues, his argument is that really, as opposed to a colonial temporal way of thinking, the Native American way of thinking was always spatial. So in relation to history, the question that they asked is not when did it happen, but where did it happen? So everywhere history manifested itself in space. And this is exactly what we are seeing today, really. I mean, in a sense, you can read climate change through that template. The impacts of climate change can be read through that template. I mean, see, for example, the flooding in the Upper Missouri Basin. That was an instance of a massive environmental intervention by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which created this whole network of dams, which absolutely fundamentally geoengineered, if you like, that landscape. Similarly, we see, it's interesting how, when you look around the places where the impacts of climate change are now being most powerfully felt, within the credential discourse, it's often represented as through GDP. People say, oh, the poorest will be most affected, the poorest will be hurt the most, and so on. And that's certainly true in terms of people. But if you look at in terms of the landscape, if you look in terms of space, the spaces that are most affected are, in fact, a lot of them are in areas that were colonized and most extensively geoengineered. California, southeastern Australia. That's a very striking correlation, and I think it shows. So Vine Deloria, writing in the 1970s, predicted all this. And indeed, Native American thinkers have said that this would happen since the mid-19th century. So many. It's really kind of uncanny to go back and read those voices today, because they were saying so clearly that you settlers don't know this land. You don't know what you're doing. You don't understand it.
Yes, that's it reminds me of a lot of things, and I think I think you're really kind of hitting on something important here, and it ties to, I think, some other issues that you raise in the Great Derangement, with respect to especially agency and personhood, right? And one of the things I found so interesting in the Great Derangement is you're bringing to the fore debates that have certainly been going on within South Asian studies and more broadly over the past many years around human, non-human relations, right? And how we understand human, non-human relations with respect to the question of agency, and how under the conditions of modernity, agency is funneled into the individual, to the subject, to the I, who gets seen as a kind of bounded self. And of course, this is a very central aspect of both the limits and the possibilities of the ways in which popular discourse about climate change unfolds, which has to do with, well, what could I, what could I, a mere, person on the street, possibly do to change the course? It will take collective action, right? It will take these huge efforts by states and through the, Paris Accord. And it seems to me that that this has to do with some of the limits of our resources in thinking about what constitutes agency, and also the relationship between the individual and the collective, which in many worldviews, and I think as you even point out, this idea of, you invoke Latour's work in The Great Derangement to talk about how, we have never been modern, right? We've never had this separation of culture from nature. There's always been this kind of hybridity, just as we've never had, what Charles Taylor might call a kind of a bounded self, right? Completely closed off. And I wonder if I can ask you to reflect a bit on that. Maybe by bringing in, if you might, how you wrote about this in Gun Island, which I think is a book that, first of all, redeems your promise in The Great Derangement to kind of move beyond the human by bringing in other characters, right? You talk about the ways in which literature has been kind of siphoned into the human subject, this very anthropocentric genre. So I wonder if you can maybe talk about this, these other senses of agent, non-human actors, and how they figured in maybe to your writing of Gun Island. If I can ask you to bring in a bit about that, since it's a recent book of yours, and I'm sure many of the people in attendance, will have read it or are familiar with it. But yeah, so it's a question really about agency and the limits of the individual subject in terms of how we approach this.
Thank you again for that question. Yes, absolutely. I mean, as you said yourself, really, this is one of the effects of an emergent modernity that starts in the 16th, 17th century, where all other beings come to be thought of as essentially robots or brutes or mechanisms, if you like. And this is true not only actually of non-humans. It's also true of most humans. I mean, really, most humans were thought of by upper-class Europeans as being brutes. I mean, that's what justified their enslavement and their colonization and so on. And we should not forget that continued really well into the 20th century. So in effect, I think if I ask myself the question that I'm sitting here today talking to you, you're within one of the West's great educational institutions, 100 years ago or 150 years ago, that would not have been possible because I would not have been considered, I would not have been given the right to speak. I would have been thought, in the usual colonial tropes of, childish or anyway, not able to articulate myself. So if I apply that thinking in relation to myself, and I think who are all the other brutes that have been silenced, and amongst this whole range of brutes, there are many that were never thought to be silent. Trees, forests, animals of many kinds. And here again, I really think that, Vine Deloria's articulation of these issues is so interesting because, and really of the entire spectrum of Native American thinking again, because you were talking about the idea of collective action. Now, see, in the Western tradition, what follows upon the idea of nature as something that humans stand outside is also ecological thought or environmental thought, which springs from a position that the human is in a place of it's a managerial approach, if you like. It's a managerial approach to managing the environment and so on through the application of science. And we've seen that, in fact, movements based upon this kind of thinking have actually failed time and time again to generate enough enthusiasm. The Green Movement in the 70s, it was very popular in Europe for a while, but then it faded. And today, really, the Greens are struggling to generate enthusiasm. They're struggling to generate a following. On the other hand, what has really succeeded, if you like, are movements which take a completely different approach. For example, the No Dakota Pipeline movement, which was a movement of a completely different order that broke absolutely with conventional modernist kind of political thinking. And there, that break comes about through a concept. And the concept is the Native American concept of acting in order to protect all our relatives. And all our relatives are all these other beings. I think this should be the founding idea, on which people build a new kind of movement, an idea of acting in order to protect all other beings, not an anthropocentric kind of thing, kind of movement, movement which is centered again on this imagining of the human as the center of everything that exists. But in order for this to happen, obviously, we have to have the stories. One of the very interesting things about the No DAPL movement, of course, is that people constantly told stories. One thing that struck me very much, again, visiting the sites of the Occupy movement, how important stories and books were for those protesters. So it is really, in a sense, for us as writers and artists and intellectuals to create a new kind of imaginative resource, which is also founded on the idea of letting all our relatives speak.
Yes, thank you. I'll just pose two more questions. One kind of building on the points you've been making, and then one more specific about the Sundarbans, which I know is an area of interest to you, and I think probably many of our many of the members of our audience. And I mean, it seems part of what you're talking about is the need to incorporate different communicative registers, different languages, different grammars, different ways of articulating what is going on, right? And you referenced that with respect to thinking about this in terms of an issue of justice, right? Which is not necessarily so that the people that you were interacting with in Italy, for example, this idea of justice was much more significant, or that in other contexts the concept of justice comes to the fore. And one of the places this does in your work to date is at the end of the Great Derangement. And this being IRCPL, I need to ask a question that has to do with religious vocabularies or spiritual vocabularies or metaphysical vocabularies, because one of the things you say at the end of the Great Derangement is that, quote, the most promising development in recent years in terms of activism is the increasing involvement of religious groups and leaders in the politics of climate change. And this follows a set of reflections on the Paris Agreement, but also Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical. So I wonder if I can push you to say a bit more about maybe non-secular, non-scientific, I mean, if I can be so cut and dry, vocabularies and grammars, and if there are particular terms that you think, or ways of framing an understanding that you think we need to draw more from, right? Because the ways in which a Catholic Pope or a Buddhist activist on the streets of Yangon might talk about this are going to be very different, right? So I wonder if I can ask you to reflect a bit more on that question of the kind of language that we need and the terms that you think need to be more central to public debate.
Look, the reality is that mainstream religions everywhere have become modernist in some sense. That's true even of, it's true of Catholicism, it's true of a lot of Buddhist practices in Thailand, for example. It's also true in India, it's true in Turkey. So, so the Pope, for example, has in effect broken, with a certain kind of conservative Catholicism. And, especially in the US, many conservative Catholics can't forgive him for that. And one of his offenses in their eyes is precisely that he gives so much importance to Saint Francis of Assisi, because Saint Francis of Assisi is seen by many theologians and so on, as you know, as almost a pantheist. Because he did claim to be able to speak to animals and to speak to birds, and that birds spoke to him. So in many ways, Saint Francis represents a shamanic tradition at the heart of Catholicism. And what is so interesting is that this Pope has chosen, against the full weight and pressure of a mechanistic modernity, to push back and break with that. And I find that I think his appeal really comes from that, because I think he's understood, again, that many mainstream religions now are really just about politics. They're not about any kind of inner life or any kind of spiritual life. And there again, I think, it's so interesting to contrast that with, a Native American or indigenous tradition of protest and resistance, in which really religion, if one can use that word necessarily, religion has always been absolutely central. In that respect, I must say, there's another indigenous thinker whose work I find incredibly inspiring and powerful, and that is Davi Kopenawa. You may know his book, The Falling Sky, which was written in collaboration with Bruce Albert. It's a really remarkable book, because it presents a completely, it's a very political book. It arises out of his political, Davi Kopenawa's engagements, but he articulates what we might call a shamanic or a vitalist politics, and I think that is really where the strength of, the protests today might come from. Because you look at, say, for example, Greta Thunberg's incredible popularity, the meteoric rise, and I'm an absolute fan of Greta Thunberg. I hugely admire what she says. But, in a sense, Greta Thunberg says repeatedly and always that, follow the science. But, the people who she's inspired, the people who follow her, certainly don't follow her because of her prowess in science. It's because she's tapped into some sort of very powerful archetype in the Western imagination, in the European imagination, an archetype that goes back to the child redeemer, the archetype of Joan of Arc, for example, And on that basis, she has really inspired so many millions of people. And when I look at the practices, of let's say Extinction Rebellion and the writers who are involved with it and so on, one of the things that strikes me so much is the role of storytelling, for one, but also performance. that dance has become so important a part of it. Because, you know, in any kind of vitalist thinking about the world, dance has always been a very important part. I say this as someone who's hopeless at dancing, but I can recognize that, you know, more than any other practice, what challenges structures of power is dance.
Yeah, so you know, it is interesting how the body gets taken out of it. I mean, you know, that this is, you know, the classic pitfalls of the public sphere, that it's supposed to be this kind of disembodied voice, right? So yes, that provides a fantastic image. Let me ask one final question, then we have many from the audience, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. And it really extends from high school students up through you know, faculty here at the university, and I want to get a kind of cross section. But I want to ask a more specific question that has to do with a case that you alluded to briefly, which I've already mentioned, and again, which forms an important context for Gun Island, and that's on the Sundarbans. So I wonder if I can ask you a more kind of specific question. So this past August, Debjani Bhattacharya and Meghna Mehta published a two-part essay in The Diplomat, arguing against the approach of managed retreat for the people of the Sundarbans. On the basis of what they've been told by local people, many don't want to leave, and many think of the swamps as actually flood dependent rather than a flood risk. So there's an example of the ways in which the framing, depending on who you ask, might be slightly different. And I wonder if this slight yet profound difference can make a difference in an approach to the particularities of that case. And I want to just read to you one point that they raise in one of their articles. They write, quote, "Our contention is that today's dominant approach to Sundarbans policy espoused by the government and development partners, the construction of embankments, the enforced separation of humans and nature, and longer-term managed retreat, does not take seriously the diverse realities, desires, and especially multifaceted vulnerabilities of the people who this policy will affect." So I wonder what you make of this, and if you have any particular reflections on the ways in which managed retreat ought to be approached in this particular case, or more generally, against that backdrop of what they invoke as a kind of alternative set of desires and commitments.
Well, thank you for that, Matthew. You know, I also wrote another book about the Sundarbans, which is set in the Sundarbans, called The Hungry Tide. So, you know, that one set entirely in the Sundarbans. And so if I had to, I could give you a very long answer to this interesting question, but I'll try and keep it short. See, the whole question, I haven't read these two articles, so I'm at a bit of a disadvantage, but from your account of it, I certainly agree with them that this approach of building embankments is not going to work in the future. You know, already in the Sundarbans, you can see, you know, even before this latest cyclone Amphan hit the Sundarbans, you know, I predicted that a lot of the embankments would collapse, and it's not a very prescient prediction. Everybody knew that would happen, and it did happen. You know, the problem in the Sundarbans is that also these embankments are very much embedded in politics. You know, in politics, in corruption, in all kinds of forms of life. So it's a very complicated question, and I think it's probably right that you know, just as we've seen in the Mississippi Delta, again in the Sundarbans, it's not going to be possible to hold back the water beyond a certain point. So the question is how to adapt. Look, the people that I know and hear about are adapting, but they're adapting by adopting a kind of two-location lifestyle. So they have a sort of place to get away to, which is deeper inland, and they return, often to the Sundarbans in order to fish or to farm or whatever, So, this is actually how historically people always adapted to environmental change. I mean, they became nomadic, if you like, or they became more flexible in their lifestyle patterns. And I predict that that is also going to happen in the Mississippi Delta and in other areas. Where I completely agree with the authors that you quoted is that certainly any such program of managed retreat, if it's managed by the government, is probably going to lead to a disaster. We already know that in my book, The Hungry Tide, I write at great length about how the government came and tried to destroy and did destroy a refugee settlement in the Sundarban. It's called the Murid massacre, and you can be sure that it will lead to a lot of violence. So I think the thing to do at this point, really, and there are a lot of NGOs working in the Sundarban now, and what I would really advise them to do is to facilitate, people's own choices, make it possible for them to create this sort of, two-location lifestyle, so that when a cyclone or a flood is approaching, they have somewhere to get away to.
Okay, thank you so much. So I do want to turn to questions from the floor now. We have a number, and I will try to get to as many of them as possible. I'm afraid I'm sure I won't be able to get to all of them, although some of them overlap. So those of you whose questions I don't get to directly, I hope indirectly I will, or indeed some of the questions connect very closely to some of the issues we've already discussed with respect to the role of different kinds of vocabularies, understandings of agency, your views on religious mobilizations, etc. So let me turn first, if I can scroll through here, to a question from a colleague here at Columbia and the kind of co-director of this research project that we're running out of IRCPL, Catherine Ewing. So she asks, speaking of different temporalities, is there any evidence in your fieldwork of experience of climate change promoting a sense of the end of time, the kingdom of God at hand, for example, as something to be fostered?
I think it's perfectly clear that there are many people, as you know, what we've seen during this COVID pandemic, the emergence of groups like, what do they call, the Boogaloo Boys, who believe in accelerationism. So on many parts of the far right, there are these beliefs that, the doom should be invited rather than held off. And sadly, I must say that, these ideas are ultimately, what can we call them other than exterminatory? I mean, that's really what they are. They're an iteration of a kind of exterminationism, I certainly have never met any South Asian migrant who thinks in that way. And I don't think that that is the way in which people outside the West think, honestly.
Well, lucky us, I suppose. Okay, thank you very much. So let me turn now to a question from Bram Hubble. Thank you for a great talk. I have a class of high school students here in New York City who just finished reading The Great Derangement, and some of whom are watching this talk tonight. As you think about how we reframe our understanding of the climate crisis, as a larger planetary crisis, how do you think they can take the insights of your talk and carry them into the world?
Well, I would sort of urge them in the first place to try not to silo these problems, to acknowledge and understand the interactions between these various problems, which in any case, they'll see evidence of that if they just look out of their windows. I mean, certainly the COVID pandemic, the way that that's interacted with issues of racial justice, and if you're in California or somewhere, you will also see that interacting with climate change, with the wildfires, with so many of these other phenomena. So I think it's important at every point to not silo these phenomena, to try and understand that there is a certain kind of wholeness behind them. And that wholeness ultimately springs from human interactions, really from human conflicts.
Okay, thank you. So the next question, I believe, is from Melinda Banerjee. I was wondering about the political, social, and even theological thinking of the Bangladeshi quote-unquote climate refugees. Given the rich traditions of thinking about human, non-human relations in the Bengal Delta, are some of these environmental political theologies animating refugee thinking and resistance to conditions of local and transnational or imperial oppression?
That's a very interesting question. I must say that it's not easy to sum up the views of the refugees on how they see the world. But I certainly think that they bring to these issues a very different perspective from the usual Western perspectives. Actually, there is a psychoanalyst working in Italy who has worked extensively with especially refugees from Africa, and he's done some very interesting work on their worldviews and how they conceptualize their issues, how they conceptualize their movement, even their journey, because often the narratives that are built around these journeys are actually narratives of ordeal, of proving yourself worthy of something. So, there are all these other framings that are at work.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Sayari Ghoshal here at Columbia. Thank you for the wonderful talk. Following your insightful argument about understanding climate migration as a more situated, historical, and interdisciplinary thing, rather than a novelty of this moment, how can we rethink our assumption about nature as something distinct from humans and human imprints?
This whole idea of nature is one of the most insidious contributions of the European Enlightenment, honestly. I mean, it's really so much of the disaster that we see around us springs from this idea of nature being something separate from human beings. It's just such a, and it to get over it again is also very, very difficult, because it's so deeply embedded in it has become so deeply embedded in our thinking, and it's influenced forms of thought everywhere. But that's why I really think that, in opposition, to me, the most powerful idea put forward as an alternative to this conceptualization of nature as something that exists outside and in opposition to humans is this idea of all our relatives. This conceptualization of the world around us as all being interrelated, as all being different in form, but not in essence.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm just scrolling to my next question. So this is from Zania Patel. In Gun Island, you make use of the metaphor of the boot or ghost. Could you elaborate on how the past being a presence may highlight the difference in which way the global North and South perceive history?
Well, you know, I think once you start thinking about what are all the forms of agency around us, if you accord agency to animals, to spaces, to geographical features, you automatically open the door to other forms of agency as well. That is to say, the agency of those who have preceded us, you know, and that is something I think human beings almost universally accept, even as they find themselves compelled to deny the agency of the past manifesting itself in the present in these various ways. So I would say that, you know, when you open the door to a non-human agency, there's a whole world of beings crowding in.
Okay, so the next question is from Anandita Sabharwal. You mentioned that the psychology of consumption in newly powerful middle classes, such as those of India and China, is based on the issue of justice and the knowledge that the West exploited their natural resources in the past. How do you think this psychology can be altered? How can we make pro-environmental action? How can we promote pro-environmental action among the middle classes of these societies? So tall orders for you tonight. I think these questions are, but yes, please.
That's an interesting question because see, what is it founded on? What is this idea of justice founded on? That particular idea of justice, that I must have what they have. You know, that was not Gandhi's idea of justice. That was not Gandhi's way of approaching these problems at all. He's, you know, he says very clearly that, you know, we can't live as they do because we consume the world. You know, and he was willing to make that sacrifice on behalf of his countrymen. If any politician anywhere in the world were to say that today, they would never win another election. They would be drummed out of office, really. So when we think about that, let's just remember that, you know, fundamentally this idea of justice is mimetic. It's based upon a kind of mimicry. What you're saying is that I want to be them. So how do you change? How do you introduce change there? There's only one way. That is the object of desire. That is the object who is being mimicked must change. You know, and if that object, which means the high consuming world, were to change their practices, were to seriously embrace other forms of practice, other forms of living, that is the only possible way in which you can change this. But, you know, simply because this idea is mimetic, it admits to change. You know, it's fundamentally very fragile. You know, it can be undone.
Okay, so there are a few questions. I'm going to try to synthesize a few questions with respect to the particular examples you've raised with, especially in relation to, say, North American indigenous thinkers. But a few of the questions raise the issue not only of kind of West, non-West, North, South, and these other kinds of demarcations, but also those of gender, right? I mean, can you speak to the ways in which the alternatives to what we have on offer might be articulated through the lens of feminism, right? So that's one of the questions that's being posed. So someone asked that you had cited Naomi Klein to talk about, you know, what she has to say about capitalism. But what about feminism or feminisms? What do they bring to the table, do you think? And how can we take, or how ought we to take, kind of gendered perspective with respect to climate change and the kinds of alternative visions that you want to marshal?
Oh, I think it's absolutely crucial. You know, I mean, I mentioned Naomi Klein, but also Naomi Oreskes and so on. But you know, for me personally, I think the strains of environmental feminism have been very, very important. Thinkers like Anat Singh, Donna Haraway, and really Caroline Merchant, you know, who was one of the first people to sort of start challenging, you know, a kind of the dominance of a sort of mechanistic worldview. So these are very important interventions from all of them as thinkers. But again, in terms of practice, now if you look at the protests against the Dakota pipeline, they were all, I mean, women played an absolutely crucial role in them. You know, I mean, it was actually, it was a woman called Donna Bravebull who opened up her house and allowed protesters to stay there. She's one of the, she's also a historian and has spoken and written about these protests at great length. Donna Bravebull Allard is a full name. So, you know, I think feminism and also, you know, other kinds of critiques of the dominant paradigms are absolutely essential to creating any kind of alternative view of the future. I mean, you know, the ways in which the future has come to be dominated by certainly a sort of incredibly masculinist vision of escaping to Mars, or you know, building a parallel satellite planet and so on. These are absolutely expressions of a certain kind of colonial masculinity, you know, and they have to be challenged, and they have to be, and some of the most powerful challenges have come from feminists. At the same time, you know, we can't also forget that there is a kind of mainstream feminism which is really about you know, careers and so on. And I don't know if that is necessarily helpful, but you know, the feminism has offered some of the most important and profound critiques of you know, dominant paradigms.
Well, you mentioned there an issue that came up in another question, this one from Teresa Heffernan, who wants to know about your view of the kind of techno-utopian billionaires and transhumanists. I mean, in a sense, we've talked about kind of post-humanism, but of course, there are also transhumanists. These kind of Silicon Valley types tend to be men who want to, you know, spend billions of dollars to preserve their lives, or shoot themselves off to another planet. So the question is, how do you respond to these kind of Silicon Valley versions of techno-utopian, you know, salvation, right?
Look, on the one hand, I think there's a kind of element of absurdity in them, you know. I mean, not within any kind of realizable human timescale are they going to be able to geoengineer Mars so that they can escape to it, you know. So there is a kind of there is a kind of weirdness about these ideas, which makes you realize that in fact these people are seized by a sort of millenarian longing, you know. There are many aspects of this that you can see. I mean, it's so clear that really this whole idea of escaping to another planet springs from a colonial experience. You know, from the colonial experience of terraforming a new continent, if you like, you know. So in a way, what they're hankering to do is what their forebears in America did, which was to geoengineer an enormous landscape, and that's the nature of the fantasy. What is not said in that fantasy is that fantasy is built upon an idea of elimination. In the case of the colonial fantasy, it was the elimination of native populations. Here, implicitly, what is being said, what is actually meant when someone says that I've bought myself a bunker in New Zealand and I've got a plane waiting to take me off there. What is being said, of course, is that there's going to be this crisis, billions will die, and then I'll come out of my bunker later when many billions of people are dead, and that will result in a sustainable planet. So, in a sense, the logic of this is completely eliminatory and exterminationist. What else can you say? Those things cannot be said plainly today, because of conventions of speech or whatever. But it's implied. It's absolutely implied in all these techno-utopian visions.
So, on a related issue to billionaires, or not, as the case may be, as we've learned in recent days, Jack Hawley has asked or offered a provocation about whether we can think of kind of how we should think of Donald Trump with respect to all of this. Can we understand Trump as a vitalist? He asks.
No, I don't think one can say that that Trump is a vitalist. But certainly Trump does very much tap into, the whole phenomenon around him. Okay, let me backtrack a little bit. The last time there was a great change in technologies of communication was when print culture came into being. And what came into being along with print culture was witch burning. This great witch craze that seized Europe. And in that sense, I think when you look at the rise of Trump, the rise of social media, the rise of the internet, and so on, you can see suddenly that there is the introduction of a new form, a new technology of communication on this scale creates a profound instability within mental landscapes, within people's landscapes of belief. And certainly, if you look at what was happening on the internet in 2016 around Trump, there were all these strange memes, For one thing, that whole sort of, you look at QAnon and you look at, that Pizzagate meme that was circulating then. It completely borrows the language of a certain kind of witchcraft. The idea that children are being devoured and so on and so forth. So you do see these sort of peculiar parallels, but I wouldn't say at all that this implies vitalism. It's much more like Western occultism. And Western occultism was ultimately also completely anthropocentric. I mean, all those people who were doing the planchettes and and so on and so forth. And what were they trying to summon? They were trying to summon other dead humans. It's impossible to imagine any of those occultists speaking of all my relatives. That language simply doesn't exist within Western occultism.
Thank you. So a couple more questions from the audience, and there's a kind of slow transition here. We've talked about billionaires. We've talked about billionaires who are not billionaires, who are populists and tyrants. But there's a question about Hindu nationalism. From Ayesha Vemuri. Can you talk about the co-constitution of the crisis of Hindutva supremacy and the climate crisis? Do you see them as intertwined, and how?
Oh, yes, absolutely. They're completely intertwined. And again, it's not just India, it's also Turkey. It's Turkey, and in lesser ways, it's, you could say, you see something similar happening around around right-wing circles in the United States. A lot of this has to do, I think, with social media, with the internet and the forms of politics that have been enabled by the internet. And, you know, and of course, along with that, it's also the complete dominance of capital. You know, especially within India, you know, the concentration of capital in the hands of a very small group, which now Indian media are completely controlled by a tiny group of billionaires. The same is true in Turkey. The same is true, you know, in so many other places. So what we're really seeing is this is the outcome of these decades of neoliberalism, really.
Okay, so I want to ask one more question in relation to the subject of your talk and our discussions thus far, and then I'd like to end, if I might, with a slightly indulgent question, maybe to transition us out after an important and serious evening of thought, but to maybe inject a bit of lightness, which we desperately need every day, given the current state of the world. So, but the last question with respect to your talk is a very general one. So you mentioned right at the beginning that you wanted to shift, or maybe you're shifting from a language of climate change to a language of planetary crisis. Of course, more generally within these arenas of debate, certainly within the academy, but beyond, there are all sorts of terms in play about how we should label or name the current era. You mentioned the Anthropocene. You've mentioned the work of Donna Haraway, you know, who speaks of it in terms of the Cthulhucene. There's the capitalist-cene, the plantationist-cene. So you've alighted upon planetary crisis tonight, at least at the start. I wonder if you can just offer us a few reflections on, yeah, the pros and cons of these different labels or configurations, and ones that you definitely want to champion, and if there are others that you think need to be pushed to the side.
You know, there's such a huge proliferation of these scenes, you know, and I think it's because, look, the people who think them up are almost all academics, you know, and academics just like to label things, you know, so that's what it comes out of. The Anthropocene, look, it's said to be a geological marker, and based upon certain specific, you know, findings and so on by geologists. If it serves a purpose, then if it serves the purpose of actually persuading people that, you know, this thing is happening, you know, that human beings are leaving a mark on the geological structure of the planet, then it might be useful. But is it useful in any other way? No, I don't really think it is. And I think, you know, to spend time debating it is really, I mean, to me at least, a complete waste of time. I mean, it's I just don't see it. I just don't see the point of it, honestly. I mean, and so many of these terms are really not. I mean, they don't really make sense. I mean, a capitalocene, okay, but you know, through the 20th century, the Soviet Union, for much of the 20th century, wasn't capitalist. China wasn't. India was nominally socialist. So, you know, in exactly the period when this crisis was accelerating, you can't really just tie it to capital. I mean, the Soviet Union was incredibly destructive of its environment, on Stakhanovite principles. So, we already talk. Honestly, I just don't think this is a productive.
Leave it to the academics.
Yeah.
Well, so okay, I'd like to transition out with a very different kind of question, if I may. Given that we have with us such an esteemed writer and such an esteemed novelist, I wanted to ask you a question with respect to writing. So a few years ago, I visited Roald Dahl's house with my children in Great Missenden, not far outside of London. And apparently he always wrote in the same beat up lounge chair with a tatty lap desk on yellow ruled paper with a particular kind of pencil produced in upstate New York, the Ticonderoga No. 2, that he would have imported into England. So that's quite a ritual, right? I wonder if you could share with us whether you have any writing rituals of your own, or how it is that you do what you do in producing these sweeping trilogies and other magisterial works.
Well, I think all writers have rituals, really. Writers and sportsmen. Sportsmen have, athletes have endless numbers of rituals. I mean, look at Rafael Nadal. I mean, he has like 100 rituals every time he gets up to play. And I think most writers are like that too. I mean, we all have our little rituals. For me, the paper I write on is very important. What I write with is very important. I also often write on a lap desk while seated or while sitting in bed. I also write mainly by pencil. All my drafting is in pencil. And then I move to a pen and ruled paper. That is again another very important part of my whole work process. And it's only really at the end that I start typing. So I think it's these rituals are very important to the work life of most writers.
Well, I think we'll all rush out and get some pencils in hope of production and productivity. Amitav, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I want to thank all of the attendees. We had quite a turnout tonight, I know, from across not only New York City, but or across the United States, but well beyond. We really appreciate your contributions to our discussions here, and we look forward to seeing your work in the future and engaging with it further. So thank you very much, and again, thanks to everyone for your attendance this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thanks to all of you who attended and for participating. So thank you, and goodbye.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.